Lucy, this young man, Jacob Brown, isn't just good looking. His career is already secured. By the end of the year, he'll leave the military and report straight to the Railway Bureau. A stable, lifelong job. Are you sure you're going to pass on this? When I caught the matchmaker's excited expression, I realized something. I had been reborn. I was back at the point in time when the Brown family sent a matchmaker to my house. This time, I made a decision opposite to the one I made in my previous life. I don't want to meet him. The matchmaker panicked. Lucy, don't be so hasty. Let me tell you about Jacob Brown. He's not only handsome, he's known for his excellent character. You wouldn't find anyone like him within 100 miles. Do you even know how many young women dream about him? Memories of my previous life flooded my mind. I closed my eyes briefly, then interrupted her. I know. The matchmaker froze for a moment, seemingly caught off guard. She must have noticed something unusual. When I nodded, her confusion deepened. In my past life, I had indeed met Jacob Brown before the matchmaker had come to arrange this marriage. It was during the first month of my internship at the clinic in 1990. One night, while I was on duty, a family member of a patient stormed into the hallway with a kitchen knife, yelling angrily, "You heartless doctors! I'll make you pay with your lives." His crazed actions, wildly swinging the knife, terrified everyone into staying back. I was scared too, but as the only doctor on duty, I couldn't hide or run. My whole body was trembling as I stepped forward, trying to negotiate with him. "Sir, please, let's talk calmly." "There's nothing to talk about," he screamed. "I'll take one of your lives for his." The moment he saw me, his emotions spiraled out of control. Like a raging bull, he charged at me with the knife raised. The corridor was filled with screams as people scattered, trying to get away. My legs felt like they were cemented in place, unable to move. I closed my eyes instinctively, bracing for the pain of the knife's blow, but it didn't come. When I opened my eyes, a man stood between me and the attacker. With immense strength, he had grabbed and immobilized the hand holding the knife. Amid the chaos, he even turned to glance at me briefly. "Are you okay, miss?" I was too stunned to speak and could only shake my head. Soon, the attacker was subdued, but the man who had shielded me left without giving his name. I thought it would be almost impossible to find him, but before I could start asking around, a patient who had witnessed the incident recognized him immediately. "That young man is Jacob Brown from Old Brown's family. He's a soldier, just back home visiting his family." I committed Jacob Brown's name to memory. So, when the matchmaker mentioned his name, I agreed without hesitation. But that simple nod of mine caused Jacob Brown to hate me for the rest of his life. "Lucy, since you've met him, you know I'm not lying. This is a great match." The matchmaker thought there was still hope and continued promoting Jacob Brown. However, while thinking of Jacob, another name surfaced in my mind. Seeing me stay silent, the matchmaker opened her mouth to speak again, but I interrupted her. "Wait. Lucy, the Brown family is indeed a good match," I said. "But the one I want to meet is Jacob Brown's older brother, Robert Brown." After escorting the matchmaker out of the yard, I was about to head back inside when I heard someone call my name. The familiar voice sent a chill down my spine. I turned around abruptly, and there he was, Jacob Brown, standing under the pomegranate tree outside the yard. The man I remembered as a gray-haired elder was now a young man in his prime. Standing beside him was a woman in a white dress, Jasmine White, the woman he cherished for his entire life. Seeing me turn around, Jacob paused briefly before saying something to Jasmine. Their gazes lingered for a moment before they parted, and Jacob approached me. Standing before me, Jacob got straight to the point. "Lucy Carter. This time, I won't marry you. You should give up on that idea." The coldness in Jacob Brown's gaze pierced me, identical to the way he had looked at me in my past life when he watched me fall to ruin. But I caught something in his words, a crack in his statement. He said, "This time," combining that with my memories of the past, I realized something crucial. When the matchmaker had come to discuss our marriage, Jacob had still been in the military. My first formal meeting with him hadn't been until 3 months later, during the Laba festival. In just a few seconds, it became clear to me, Jacob Brown had also been reborn. His sudden appearance here could only mean one thing. He must have snuck away to stop Jasmine White from marrying someone else. And while he was at it, he was also here to prevent me from becoming his wife again. Pretending to be clueless, I gave him a blank look. Who are you? Jacob seemed startled for a moment. Then realization dawned on him. Of course. How could you possibly? He glanced at me again but stopped mid-sentence. Yet I could guess the rest of his unspoken words. How could you have been reborn too? What about me? I asked, feigning confusion. Nothing. Jacob cleared his throat as if trying to dismiss the thought. I'm Jacob Brown. My parents just sent the matchmaker to your house. Didn't they? I nodded, then pretended to have an epiphany. Oh, so you're the Jacob Brown the matchmaker mentioned. I acted as though I were meeting my blind date for the first time, deliberately giving him a scrutinizing look from head to toe. Jacob seemed nervous, his brow furrowing as if afraid I might actually like him. Lucy Carter, he began, his tone wary. I came to see if. Before he could finish, I interrupted, pretending to be disappointed. Wow, so the matchmaker said you're supposed to be 8 feet tall and as handsome as Adonis. How come you look like this? Jacob froze mid-sentence, stunned by my dismissive tone. Hey, I added with mock disdain. It turns out the matchmaker was full of lies. What a joke. My critical tone left Jacob staring at me, utterly baffled. What do you mean by that? For all his confidence, Jacob had always been a bit vain. In our past life, he had been the most sought-after bachelor in the village, famous for his good looks. He'd never had to worry about finding a match. Back then, his parents had met me during a visit to the clinic. They had liked my gentle demeanor and polite manners, which led them to arrange the matchmaker's visit. To unsettle Jacob further, I continued with a nonchalant shrug. You didn't know? When the matchmaker praised you, I was actually intrigued and wanted to meet you. Hearing this, Jacob's tense expression eased slightly, and the corner of his mouth curled up in subtle relief. But just as quickly, his faint smile disappeared when I added, but now that I've met you in person, I've realized you're just average. Your looks, average. Your build, average. Even your personality, nothing special. Honestly, you're not my type at all. I paused for effect, then delivered the final blow with a smirk. It's not just this life. I wouldn't marry you in the next life, or the one after that. Jacob's pupils contracted slightly as he processed my words. Lucy Carter. You. Jacob Brown. I cut him off firmly. I believe this is our first meeting. Please address me as Miss Carter. His eyes locked onto my face, his voice laced with disbelief. You're serious about not wanting to marry me? Of course. I replied without hesitation, nodding for emphasis. Hearing my answer, Jacob pressed his lips together, momentarily lost for words. He should have felt relieved, but a shadow passed over his expression, as though my response had caught him completely off guard. I could tell he had expected me to throw a tantrum, clinging to the idea of marrying him no matter what. Instead, I had said something entirely unexpected, that I wasn't interested in him at all. Good. That's good, he finally said, nodding slowly as if trying to convince himself. Jacob Brown gave me one last cold glance before turning and walking back toward Jasmine White. I couldn't hear what he said to her, but her shy smile immediately gave her emotions away. The two of them walked away side by side. I didn't sit idle either. As soon as I returned to the house, I grabbed some paper and a pen, quickly drafting a formal report about Jacob's unauthorized leave from his unit. The matchmaker was efficient. It wasn't long before she came back with news about Robert Brown. However, her phone call didn't bring good news. Lucy, she said hesitantly. Robert declined. He already has someone in his heart. She tried to persuade me to reconsider Jacob. Her words left me deep in thought. So Robert already had someone he liked. Even this early on, in my previous life, I had only met Robert twice. He was 4 years older than Jacob, and the two were half-brothers, born of the same father but different mothers. After their father remarried, Robert moved south with his uncle. He attended college there and stayed to run a business, rarely returning home. The first time I met Robert was at my wedding with Jacob. It was a brief encounter during the banquet. Later that night, Jacob had been heavily drunk, carried back to our room in a near unconscious state. Once the guests had left, I changed out of my wedding dress and busied myself preparing hot water to help him wash up. Afterward, I stepped out into the courtyard for a moment to rest, leaning against the steps. I hadn't noticed anyone else was there until a deep voice emerged from the darkness. "I never thought the one he married would be you." Startled, I looked up. Beneath the locust tree stood a man, his sharp features illuminated by the faint moonlight. His face was cold and enigmatic. After a moment of hesitation, I recognized him. It was Robert Brown. He stared at me for a long moment before murmuring, almost to himself, "Why did it have to be you?" I didn't understand what he meant. Then the strong smell of alcohol hit me, and I realized he must have been drinking heavily. I assumed he was just drunk and talking nonsense, so I turned to leave. But before I could, Robert followed me. Frightened, he quickly called out, "Big brother." My words seemed to snap him back to reality. His gaze swept over my face, lingering for a moment. Then he stepped back, putting a safe distance between us. With a faint, bitter smile, he said, "Sister-in-law, congratulations on your marriage. I wish you both a long and happy life together." After saying that, he turned and disappeared into the night. The second time I saw Robert was after I had been driven to death by Jacob and our son. When my soul left my body, it didn't immediately fade away. Instead, I hovered in the air, watching as Jacob and our son frantically tried to save me. They rushed me to the hospital. But when the doctor announced my death, neither of them shed a single tear. Instead, my son let out a sigh of relief. "Dad, finally. Now she can't interfere with your plan to be buried with Jasmine in the future." I had thought that death would bring an end to all pain, but hearing those words sent a cold shiver through my soul. Jacob, too, sighed with apparent relief. "Yes, now I can finally be with Jasmine openly. I only hope that in our next life, I'll meet you again, Jasmine." Jacob handled my funeral with shocking indifference. He took me straight from the hospital to the crematorium, then casually buried my ashes in a remote cemetery. He didn't even bother with a proper service, merely sending a brief message about my death in the family group chat. And that was the sum of my life, tied to Jacob Brown. Watching it all unfold, I felt only one word in my heart: regret. If I were given another chance, I will never marry Jacob Brown again. Just as my soul was about to dissipate, Robert Brown appeared at my grave. He bent down, his aging hands trembling as he gently touched the photo on my tombstone. His gaze was filled with such tenderness and sorrow as he softly repeated my name. "Lucy, Lucy, Lucy. I'm so sorry. I was too late." In that moment, I realized that in this world, in a place I had never known, someone had deeply, painfully loved me. "Do you have Robert Brown's address?" I asked the matchmaker. The matchmaker had no idea why I wanted it but still managed to find it for me quickly. Once I had the address, I spent the entire night thinking about what to write. As dawn broke, I decided to use a spare photo from my work ID and penned a single line on the letter paper. "Hello, Mr. Brown. I am your prospective match, Lucy Carter." After sending the letter, I went to the clinic to start my shift. To my surprise, the first patient I received was Jasmine White. Jacob wasn't with her, which likely meant he had quietly returned to his unit. "Dr. Carter, we meet again," Jasmine said with an overly familiar tone as she took a seat. I glanced at her briefly. "We've met before?" I wasn't close to Jasmine in my past life. We had met no more than 10 times. The first time was on the road when she returned home after her husband's death. I had no idea back then that she was the woman Jacob cherished in his heart, and I had even warmly pointed her in the right direction. "You don't remember?" Jasmine asked, her tone laced with mock surprise. Her reaction made me pause. Could she have been reborn too? But before I could delve into it, she continued, "I was standing right next to Jacob when he came to tell you he wouldn't marry you." So, she hadn't been reborn. I pretended to remember. "Oh, I see. I didn't pay much attention at the time." Jasmine's lips twitched, clearly dissatisfied with my answer. "What brings you here? Are you unwell?" I asked. "Dr. Carter, I'm not here for treatment." Jasmine crossed her legs, exuding an air of unwarranted superiority. I'm here to tell you that Jacob loves me. So, stop clinging to him. I looked at her as though she were delusional, remaining silent, mistaking my silence for acquiescence. Jasmine pressed on. Do you think secretly maintaining contact with Jacob's parents behind his back will get you anywhere? This is the modern era of free love. Jacob has already promised me that once he returns from the army, we'll get married. At that, her meaning became crystal clear. All I had done was send the matchmaker to inquire about Robert Brown, but in Jasmine's eyes, it had somehow turned into me pestering Jacob. This misunderstanding, however, sparked an even better plan for pulling Jacob down with me. I smiled faintly and said, "You're right. I do like Jacob, and Jacob's parents have made it clear that no matter how much he loves you, they'll never let you into their home. Unless, of course, you show up pregnant." The moment the words left my mouth, I covered it with my hand in feigned shock. Jasmine's expression shifted, her pride visibly wounded. Before leaving, she sneered, "Lucy Carter, with your intelligence, it's a wonder you became a doctor." Watching her leave, I couldn't help but smirk. I hope she doesn't disappoint me and brings me some useful news. Moments later, another patient walked in, glancing toward the door Jasmine had just exited. "Dr. Carter, was that woman here for a checkup? A venereal disease? Perhaps." I raised my eyes and said flatly, "Doctors are obligated to maintain patient confidentiality regarding any condition." I looked at the elderly woman and replied firmly, "We don't discuss other people's private matters here." She sat down, undeterred. "You don't have to say anything. I already know." I stared at her in confusion. "Why do you say that?" She leaned in, adopting the tone of someone sharing village gossip. "Dr. Carter, don't be fooled by her good looks and clean clothes. She works in a dance hall. How many decent people work in places like that? Men and women coming and going all the time. Who knows what they're doing inside? It's filthy. If I had a daughter like that, I'd beat her to death." I didn't know much about Jasmine White's background, but this gave me some insight. It seemed that Jacob's parents didn't approve of her and refused to let her into their family, likely because of her job and the reputation it carried. The days that followed were relatively quiet. I found myself counting on my fingers, estimating when Robert Brown might receive my letter. In this era, the fastest delivery for a letter was about a week, but it could take as long as 2 weeks or even a month. A month passed, but I still hadn't received a reply from Robert. Anxiety began to creep in. Had he not received it? Or had I been mistaken from the start? Perhaps Robert's feelings weren't for me at all. As my mind spiraled with doubts, I made a bold decision. I requested leave from work and prepared to head south to find Robert and ask him directly. 3 days later, I arrived at the address the matchmaker had given me. The door was opened not by Robert but by a strikingly fashionable young woman. She greeted me in a regional dialect I didn't understand, then switched to halting, accented Mandarin. "Who are you looking for?" I suddenly felt a wave of nervousness. I'm looking for Mr. Brown." A man's voice called from inside the house. "Who is it?" I froze, unable to speak. Reflexively, I glanced at the slip of paper with the address. It was correct. Then I looked back at the woman in front of me. My heart sank. "Sorry, I must have the wrong address," I mumbled before quickly turning away. I had just entered the stairwell when I heard their conversation behind me. "Who was that at the door?" the man asked. "A pretty woman," she replied casually. "She said she had the wrong place." "Forget about it," the man said. "It's rare for us to have the house to ourselves today." The door closed with a heavy thud, cutting off the rest of their conversation. I leaned against the concrete wall, taking deep breaths as a strange sense of guilt washed over me. Then, unable to help myself, I muttered bitterly, "Lucy Carter, you've really embarrassed yourself this time." But even as I closed my eyes, my mind couldn't help but replay the image of Robert standing at my grave, tears streaming down his face. The despair, the pain, it was so vivid. Still, it was clear now. Robert had someone else in his life. I wouldn't intrude. That same day, I booked a train ticket home for the evening. Time slipped by in the midst of this back and forth. Before I knew it, the end of the year had arrived, and Jacob Brown had completed his service and returned home. I saw him again outside a state-run restaurant, His parents, eager to celebrate his return, had organized a gathering of family and friends to welcome him back. Inside, the atmosphere was lively, filled with praise for Jacob's obedience, filial piety, and bright future at the Railway Bureau. There was even talk of finding him a good match. No one could have anticipated that Jacob would bring Jasmine White to the gathering on such a joyous day. Humiliating his parents in front of everyone, the two of them arrived together at the entrance, and as they turned, they spotted me walking out of the restaurant. The smiles on their faces instantly vanished. Jacob was the first to react. "What are you doing here?" I met his gaze calmly. "Why shouldn't I be here?" I rolled my eyes at Jacob Brown. "Is this restaurant yours?" "Lucy Carter. Is that how you talk to me?" Jacob's brow furrowed deeply, clearly displeased. In my previous life, I had been married to him for 50 years and never once stood up to him. It led him to believe he could still treat me the same way now. I curved my lips into a slight smile. "Jacob Brown, do you really think you're that important? It's a pity. You've got the arrogance, but not the fate to match it." His face darkened further at my words. His fist, hanging by his side, clenched tightly, and I could see the impulse to hit me flash in his eyes. I wasn't afraid. If he dared lay a hand on me, it would only hasten the consequences of my report to his unit. They wouldn't need to investigate further before kicking him out of his prestigious Railway Bureau position. Jasmine White, surprisingly the more rational one this time, pressed her hand against Jacob's and gave him a warning look, silently urging him to stay calm. She then stepped forward, puffing out her chest as if to defend her man. "Lucy Carter, I know why you're here. You heard Jacob was back and wanted to use his parents' presence to force another meeting with him, didn't you?" I almost laughed at her assumption. So much for giving her credit for intelligence. "Lucy Carter, I didn't expect you to be so shameless. I've already made it clear. I'm never marrying you. Just give up." As Jasmine spoke, Jacob's expression shifted as if he'd suddenly understood something. He looked at me with a dawning realization, as though this ridiculous assumption now made perfect sense to him. Jasmine continued smugly, "But let me tell you, don't waste your efforts. It won't work." She touched her stomach in a subtle motion, but it was enough. I immediately understood what she was implying. She was pregnant. Jacob, however, didn't seem to know. "Jasmine, let's not waste words on her," Jacob said, clearly eager to get away from me. He didn't even want to spend another second in my presence. Placing his hand on Jasmine's back, he guided her inside. Jasmine flashed Jacob a sweet smile. "Okay, Jacob, I'll listen to you." I watched them walk away, their faces full of smiles. Smirk all you want now. It won't be long before those smiles turn into tears. The very next morning, news about Jacob and Jasmine had already spread. Even the cleaning lady took a moment to gossip while sweeping. "Did you hear? Old Brown's son came back from the army and immediately got tangled up in a scandal. Knocked some girl up already." I heard. "Lucy, did you hear about this?" I was just passing by when the cleaning lady called out to me, pretending to know nothing. I asked, "Hear what? You don't know? Let me tell you." The cleaning lady's eagerness to share was almost tangible. "Last night, after you left, Jacob brought Jasmine home to meet his parents. Before Jacob could even say a word, his father saw Jasmine and immediately shouted, 'Get out!' She clapped her hands for emphasis, scared Jasmine so much she burst into tears right there. Jacob, of course, couldn't stand to see her cry. He shielded her behind him, and the argument quickly escalated. His parents even mentioned your name." "Really? What did they say?" I asked casually. "They told him, 'Son, you're letting this fox enchant you. Any woman off the street would be better than her. Look at Dr. Carter from the clinic. Her looks, her education.'" This point, the cleaning lady lowered her voice, mimicking Jacob. "And you know what he said? 'Dad, I will never marry anyone but Jasmine. If you try to force me to marry Lucy Carter, I'd rather die in a car accident today.'" Hearing this, his father was so furious he nearly fainted on the spot. No matter how private the room was, such a commotion couldn't stay hidden for long. Soon, people in the restaurant began gathering outside their door, drawn by the shouting. When they looked in, They saw Jasmine kneeling tearfully in front of Jacob's parents, crying so pitifully it tugged at their hearts. Through her sobs, she pleaded, "Uncle, Auntie, I know you don't like me." Jasmine White pleaded, her voice soft and tearful. "But Jacob and I truly love each other. Please, I beg you, let us be together." Jacob's mother pointed at Jasmine, her voice sharp with anger. "Fox spirit, you're nothing but a homewrecker." Jasmine lowered her head, silently enduring the barrage of insults. When Jacob's mother finally ran out of steam, Jasmine lifted her head slightly and said, "I'm pregnant with Jacob's child." Her words hung in the air, silencing the entire room. Jacob's parents were stunned, and even Jacob himself looked completely taken aback. At this point, there was no room left for his parents to oppose the relationship. Begrudgingly, they helped Jasmine to her feet and closed the door to discuss the marriage arrangements in private. But it was a busy restaurant, and gossip spread like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone was talking about it. She finished her tale with a satisfied grin. Before she could continue, a nurse interrupted us. "Dr. Carter, someone's here to see you." "Who is it?" I asked casually. "I don't know," the nurse replied. "But he's tall, handsome, and very distinguished looking." Curious, I stepped outside. The moment I saw him, I froze. It was Robert Brown. This was the third time I had seen him across 2 lifetimes. His features were even more striking than I remembered, his face sharp and refined. He wore a brown trench coat that perfectly complemented his commanding presence. His arrival turned heads, as passers-by couldn't help but steal glances at him. Within moments, Robert approached me. He wasted no time, speaking urgently. "I received your letter." Memories of my failed visit to the South flashed through my mind. Quickly composing myself, I lied without hesitation. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brown, but I didn't send any letter." Robert's eyes widened slightly. "It wasn't you?" "No," I said, sticking to my story. "It must have been my younger cousin playing a prank." Internally, I winced at my excuse. "Sorry, little cousin. You're taking the blame for this one." Robert's gaze didn't waver. His sharp eyes locked onto mine. "But they said you came looking for me a month ago. Is that true?" My lie unraveled before me, leaving me no choice but to confess. "Fine, Mr. Brown. Yes, I sent the letter. And yes, I came looking for you. But at the time, I didn't know you were married." "Lucy," Robert interrupted firmly. "I'm not married. I don't even have a girlfriend." I stared at him, stunned. "But He seemed to anticipate what I was about to say and began explaining. "For years, I've avoided contacting my family, but I couldn't cut ties entirely. The address I gave them was for my business partner. The people living there aren't related to me, and I didn't receive your letter right away." His explanation caught me off guard. "How can I be sure you're telling the truth?" I asked, hesitant. He looked genuinely pained by my distrust. "You don't believe me, Lucy." After everything I had endured in my previous life, I was no longer the naive girl I once was. My silence stretched on for several seconds. Robert seemed to take my hesitation as his answer. With a quiet sigh, he said, "All right, I understand." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I watched his retreating figure, a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside me. My heart skipped a beat. He's leaving just like that? Halfway through his departure, as if suddenly remembering something, Robert Brown turned back and said to me, "Lucy Carter, wait for me. Promise me you'll wait." Then he disappeared into the crowd. I stood there briefly, lost in thought, before refocusing on my work. The next time I saw Robert was 2 days later. In the afternoon, I had just finished my shift when he arrived. This time, though, he wasn't alone. He was dragging another man by the collar as he hurried toward me. "Explain," Robert demanded, shoving the man forward. The man brushed at his collar in annoyance. "Let go of me. You're going to ruin my shirt." Just then, a head peeked out from behind the man. When they saw me, they exclaimed in broken Mandarin, "Oh, pretty lady. We meet again." I blinked in surprise. You too." Robert released the man and gestured toward him. "This is Song Hao, my business partner and friend." Song Hao straightened his collar and greeted me with a smile. Dr. Carter. Hello. At Robert's pointed look, Song Hao quickly wrapped his arm around a woman standing beside him. This is my wife, Meng Jia. To ensure I believed him, he even pulled out their marriage certificate, holding it up for me to see. The whole display left me torn between amusement and exasperation. It was only then that I fully understood Robert's earlier words. Wait for me. He had gone to great lengths to bring Song Hao and Meng Jia here, flying them into the province and then taking an overnight bus, all just to prove the truth to me. In that moment, it felt as though my heart had been struck by a sugar-coated missile, sweet and overwhelming. As we sat together, Song Hao filled me in on the details I hadn't known. It turned out that my letter had arrived just a week after I sent it. However, it had been buried in a pile of other correspondence and ignored. At the time, Robert was away in Nanyang. It wasn't until he returned and sorted through the letters that he found mine. When Meng Jia saw the photo I'd included, she suddenly remembered meeting me before. Once Robert learned I had come looking for him, he couldn't wait any longer and rushed to find me. So that was the truth of it all. When I looked back at Robert, he was watching me, his eyes brimming with love. Do you believe me now? He asked softly. I nodded. I do. Whether in my past life or this one, I truly believed him. Robert Brown genuinely loved me. Ignoring the curious stares of passers-by, I stepped forward and embraced him. Robert, let's get married. The day we went to register our marriage, we were just leaving the civil affairs office when we ran into Jacob Brown and Jasmine White. Jacob's eyes immediately locked onto me. Lucy Carter, big brother. He froze when he noticed Robert standing beside me. His gaze dropped to our intertwined hands, and his face filled with shock. You two, how are you together? Robert, acting as if he were guarding a treasure, quickly pulled me behind him, as though afraid Jacob might take another look at me. Compared to Jacob, Robert remained composed and unbothered. He chuckled coldly. Why are you so surprised? Lucy Carter, come here. Jacob barked, his voice filled with frustration. Explain yourself. Why are you with my brother? In our past life, Jacob had always been jealous of Robert. That jealousy carried into this life. And now he was directing all his anger at me. I wanted to step forward and confront Jacob, but Robert firmly held me in place, refusing to let me go. From behind Robert Brown, I shot back at Jacob Brown. It's none of your business. Perhaps Jacob was so overwhelmed by the scene in front of him that he lost his composure. Lucy Carter, do you even know that you're my wife? The moment those words left his mouth, Robert's fist connected with Jacob's face, sending him stumbling back a few steps. Robert towered over him, glaring down. Watch your mouth, he said coldly. She's my wife. Jacob licked the blood off the corner of his mouth, seemingly ready to argue back. But Jasmine White quickly grabbed his arm. Jacob, stop. Her voice brought him back to his senses. Perhaps he remembered that I had once been his wife, but only in a past life. However, that stubborn, suffocating possessiveness of his refused to let him back down easily. You know what, Lucy? Jacob sneered, trying to provoke me. I get it now. You couldn't marry me, so you turned to my brother just to spite me, didn't you? Even now, Jacob still thought I couldn't live without him. This time, I stepped out from behind Robert, meeting Jacob's self-assured and angry gaze. Calmly, I said, Jacob Brown, do you know what you look like right now? Confusion flickered across his face. Pointing to a pile of dog waste by the road, I said, that. Jacob's face twisted with fury. You're comparing me to dog shit. No, I corrected him, my tone icy. You're worse than dog shit. Robert seized the moment to step in. Darling, there's no need to waste words on people who don't matter. It's beneath you. You're right. Honey, I said, flashing Robert a sweet smile. Let's go. We turned and walked away, leaving Jacob behind. His teeth were clenched so tightly in anger that I thought they might shatter. Fine. Jacob roared after us. Very well. Lucy Carter, if you knew what happened in your past life, you'd regret the choices you've made today. But before he could see me regret anything, Jacob found himself regretting instead. Moments later, several uniformed officers approached him. After presenting their documentation, they informed Jacob he needed to return with them for an investigation. Robert, seemingly eager to tell the world that I was his wife, had somehow procured a bag of candies. Everywhere we went, he handed them out, greeting people warmly. As a result, I heard every well wish imaginable that day. Some people recognized Robert. "Hey, aren't you Old Brown's eldest son? You're back." Though Robert didn't like being referred to as Old Brown's son, he simply smiled and replied, "Yes, it's me." Someone else chimed in. "So the Browns sent a matchmaker to Dr. Carter's house not for their youngest son but for their eldest? Who would have thought Old Brown's eldest son would be so handsome? He and Dr. Carter look amazing together." By the time we returned home, the sky was nearly dark. Ever thoughtful, Robert heated water to soak my feet. When he held my foot to remove my shoes, I instinctively pulled back. Feeling awkward, he looked up at me. "What's wrong?" Embarrassed, I laughed nervously. "They smell." Of course, my feet didn't actually smell, but this was the first time anyone had done something like this for me, and I felt uneasy. Robert said nothing, simply removing my socks. Then, to my shock, he leaned down and kissed the top of my foot before looking up at me with a soft smile. "Smells sweet," he said. I was utterly stunned. "Haha, my dear wife." Robert Brown chuckled, nudging me gently. "In my eyes, everything about you is perfect." I closed my gaping mouth in disbelief. Is this what they mean by love makes the lover's eyes see beauty everywhere? As that thought crossed my mind, a memory from my past life suddenly surfaced, eerily similar to this moment. I was about 8 months pregnant, my belly so large that bending over was nearly impossible. I had asked Jacob Brown to help me trim my toenails, afraid he might find it disgusting. I had even scrubbed my feet with soap and rinsed them carefully beforehand. But Jacob had looked at me with cold disdain. "You want me to cut your toenails? That's disgusting." Love, or the lack of it, was such an obvious thing. Only now, in this life, did I fully realize that truth. "What are you thinking about?" Robert asked. Noticing my distraction, I snapped out of my thoughts and met his gaze. "Oh, nothing." "As a doctor," I began, "I should tell you that feet can harbor fungus. It's not a good idea to kiss them." Robert clearly hadn't expected such a blunt and unromantic response, but he nodded earnestly. "All right, I'll listen to you." Still, thoughts of Jacob lingered in my mind. I felt there were things I needed to clarify with Robert. "Robert," I said, patting the empty seat beside me, "sit here. I want to talk to you about something." "What is it?" he asked, his deep eyes fixed on mine. "It's about Jacob Brown," I started, but Robert interrupted me. "Lucy, I have something to tell you first." "All right," I said. "I had a dream," Robert began. "In it, I saw you married to Jacob Brown." My heart skipped a beat. Could Robert have been reborn too? But as he continued, I realized it was just a dream, a vivid reflection of my past life. Robert's eyes softened as he looked at me. "Lucy, I've never been afraid of anything in my life. But when I woke up from that dream, I was terrified. I was scared you had really married Jacob. Scared that I'd lose you to him forever. That's why the first thing I did was go to Nanyang. I ended all my business there as quickly as I could. I wanted to find you before it was too late." His words brought tears to my eyes. I couldn't hold them back. "Thank you, Robert. Thank you for loving me, even in this life." Robert gently wiped away my tears. "You silly woman. What's there to thank me for? It's you and me. No need for thanks." Despite the warmth of the moment, a question lingered in my mind. Robert and I had never met before this life. How had he come to love me so deeply? After some persistent questioning, Robert finally confessed. It turned out he had seen me once before. Many years ago. I had been just 15 or 16 at the time, wearing 2 simple braids and following an adult around. I couldn't recall the scene he described, but it had stayed with him vividly. "When I first saw you," Robert admitted, "it was your beauty that caught my eye. But after that, I couldn't forget you." His honesty made my heart ache in the best way possible. "I've spent all these years trying to find you," Robert Brown said, his voice soft yet firm. "Finding you feels like my destiny, and now that I have, I won't let you go." I couldn't imagine how just a fleeting glance in a crowd had been enough for Robert to decide on me. But in my past life, he truly had been alone, without anyone by his side. Being loved by him felt incredible. Our eyes met, and the emotions between us deepened. Robert leaned closer, clearly intending to kiss me. I suddenly covered his mouth. He looked at me with a hint of grievance. Wife. I hadn't forgotten that he had just kissed my foot. Go brush your teeth. 10 times. Not a single one less. All right. Robert agreed obediently and went off to brush his teeth. The next time I heard news of Jacob Brown was half a month later. By then, I had resigned from my job at the clinic and was preparing to move to a southern city with Robert. While I was packing up my office, Jasmine White suddenly barged in. Seeing me, she rushed forward and grabbed my hand. Dr. Carter, help me. I looked at her, confused. Dr. Carter, can you perform an abortion for me? Jasmine asked, her eyes filled with desperation. Staring at her, I couldn't help but glance down at her noticeably swollen belly. You want an abortion? You're almost 5 months along. Yes, just reached 5 months, she replied anxiously, suppressing my shock. I said firmly, I can't do that. At this stage, it's no longer an abortion. It's an induced labor. I won't perform such a procedure. Hearing my refusal, Jasmine looked like she was about to cry. Dr. Carter, I know I've said many awful things to you before. I was out of my mind. Please, don't hold it against me. I'm begging you. Please help me. I'll even get on my knees if that's what it takes. As she spoke, she started kneeling down. To be honest, I didn't like Jasmine White. In my past life, part of the reason I died in anger was because of her. But when I thought about it, I didn't hold a grudge against her strong enough to let her grovel like this. I reached out, trying to pull her up. If you have something to say it standing up. Don't kneel like this. I won't get up unless you agree to help me, Jasmine said resolutely, willing to risk everything. Then don't get up, I replied bluntly, refusing to engage in her theatrics. I let go of her and continued gathering my belongings to leave. Panicked, Jasmine quickly stood up and chased after me. Jacob Brown is in trouble. I stopped and turned to look at her. Jacob's downfall was something I had foreseen, but I still wanted to hear it from her directly. After Jacob left his unit without authorization, someone reported him. Jasmine explained hastily. Following an investigation, the charges were confirmed. Now he's facing a 3-year prison sentence, and his job at the Railway Bureau is gone. She looked at me with pleading eyes. I can't let this child grow up with a father in prison, and I can't let this child ruin my life, either. Dr. Carter, as one woman to another, please help me. Her eyes, filled with desperation, seemed to see me as her last lifeline. Seeing how eager Jasmine was to sever ties with Jacob and get rid of his child, I couldn't help but say, Jasmine, don't you know how much Jacob loves you? He loves you so much that he'd sacrifice his life for you. Loves you enough to die for you. He even dreamed of being buried alongside you, hoping to be your husband again in the next life. I said flatly. Jasmine White sneered. Who cares about his love? Love doesn't fill your stomach or pay the bills. I hadn't expected Jasmine to be so clear-headed at such a critical moment. I couldn't help but feel a bit of admiration for her. As we spoke, Jacob Brown's parents stormed into the hospital, followed by a swarm of relatives, his aunts, uncles, cousins, and more. The moment they spotted Jasmine, they surrounded her on all sides, their voices overlapping in a barrage of accusations. Jacob's mother pointed a finger at her, furious. Jasmine White, don't you dare think about getting rid of my grandson. Dr. Carter, help me. Jasmine clung to my arm, desperate. In the end, she was dragged away by the Browns. If nothing unexpected happened, Jasmine would be forced to give birth to the child. I remembered that in my previous life, Jasmine had a congenital heart condition and died in her early 40s. I couldn't help but wonder if she would survive childbirth in this life. That moment, I found myself hoping for her safety, for both her and the child's. And, secretly, I hoped that child might be my son from the past life. After all, in their previous lives, Jacob and our son had dreamed of a perfect, happy family of 3 with Jasmine. Still, I doubted Jacob's future would be peaceful. He was no longer the man he had been in our past life, a man of status and wealth. But people always have to pay a price for what they seek. As the setting sun bathed the world in golden light, Robert Brown reached for my hand. "Lucy," he said softly, "from now until the end of our days, I'll rely on you." I smiled, my heart full of warmth. "Robert, may the rest of our lives be filled with happiness and harmony." When my cousin handed me the borrowed college entrance exam materials, she teased me with a knowing look. "Did you borrow this for Jack? You really go all out for him. Now that the college entrance exams are back, if he gets into a university, all your hard work will finally pay off." I smiled but said nothing. My cousin had guessed wrong. The books were for me, not him. Besides, there would be no sweetness in the days ahead with Jack, only endless suffering. But fortunately, I had no intention of staying with him anymore. I wouldn't have to starve myself every day to save food for him. I wouldn't need to endure the heat of summer and the chill of winter running a food stall just to support his studies, putting up with the sneers and ridicule of passers-by. In my previous life, Jack eventually achieved success. He became a university professor but despised me for being a street vendor, saying I embarrassed him in front of his prestigious colleagues. He even dumped his paralyzed mother on me. "From now on, you stay home and take care of Mom. That way, no one can laugh at us," he ordered. I used the meager allowance he gave me to juggle everything. I prepared meals for his spoiled, demanding daughter while enduring the volatile temper of his mother, feeding her, helping her wash up, and tending to her every need. Exhausted, I often managed only a few bites of food for myself before collapsing into bed, repeating the cycle day after day. At the time, I didn't even know how much Jack earned. I often deprived myself just to make sure the family was provided for. On nights when the hunger became unbearable, I would sneak into the kitchen and gulp down cold water to numb my stomach. It wasn't until later that I discovered Jack had been hiding most of his salary, secretly giving it to Susan to fund her business ventures. Eventually, his mother passed away, and the daughter grew up. All I had left were chronic illnesses and a broken body. By then, Jack looked at me with even greater disdain. "You don't understand my aspirations," he said coldly. "You can't connect with my thoughts. A housewife like you has no common ground with someone like me." He clutched his head dramatically, claiming he'd had enough, as if he were the one who had suffered the most. Even our daughter chimed in. "Mom, let Dad go. Can't you see that every day he spends with you is pure agony? Susan has been waiting for him all these years. Don't you think he deserves to spend the rest of his life in peace with her?" Compared to me, a housewife who knew nothing, Susan, now a powerful businesswoman, could effortlessly gift him luxury cars and designer bags, take him to high-end venues, and introduce him to influential figures. But it had been me who taught him to speak, word by word, when he was just a toddler. It had been me who braved the stormy nights, carrying him to the hospital when he was burning with fever. In a fit of rage, I smashed everything in the house, screaming that I would never let these ingrates have a good life. Their gazes turned cold, as if they were looking at a lunatic. Soon after, Jack and our daughter simply moved into Susan's home, when my stomach cancer flared up, leaving me vomiting blood on the floor. They were off vacationing together as a happy family, traveling to every scenic spot imaginable. Their photos flooded the internet. One a scholarly professor, the other a wealthy, elegant businesswoman. Everyone said they were a perfect match, so I decided to let Jack and Susan, the star-crossed lovers, have each other. I didn't want him anymore, and I certainly wouldn't give birth to that ungrateful child again. This time, I would walk a path without them. When I returned home, Jack was in the kitchen cooking noodles, using the pound of refined flour I had exchanged for 10 pounds of coarse grain. He made soup with an egg base and fresh greens from my garden, preparing a fragrant bowl of noodle soup. Standing beside him, wearing a floral blouse, Susan cutely sniffled, feigning delicacy. When Susan coyly sniffed the air, she murmured softly, "It smells amazing, Jack. Your cooking is incredible. How wonderful it would be if I could eat your noodles every day." In the village, food was still rationed according to labor points. Both Susan and Jack were educated youths sent to the countryside. When Jack first arrived, He couldn't even dig the soil properly. And Susan was even worse. On her first day, she stubbed her toe and had to rest at the youth dormitory for half a month. During the harvest season, they received only a small portion of grain. Meals were scarce. They'd barely finish one before worrying about the next. Hunger made their eyes gleam with desperation. Even coarse grains that stuck painfully in their throats were swallowed down with effort. Then Jack saved me when I fell into the river. The sight of us embracing for warmth after the incident was seen by others. And rumors quickly spread through the village. He had no choice but to marry me. After we got married, our labor points increased, and Jack exchanged most of the coarse grains for refined white flour. Susan became a frequent visitor to our home. Jack smiled and said to her, "If you like it, feel free to come by more often. You don't eat much anyway." But when he glanced at me, his expression turned awkward, and he fell silent. Before, he always secretly shared food with Susan when I wasn't around. This was the first time I caught him red-handed. Susan, unfazed, looked at me innocently and said, "Oh, you're back. Mary, Jack made these noodles especially. Would you like some?" Her composure made her seem more like the mistress of the house than me. Of course, it was Jack who had given her this confidence and assurance. I sneered internally and said to Jack, "From now on, let's split our labor points in our food. You eat your share, and I'll eat mine." Jack was used to taking advantage of me, knowing I would starve myself to ensure he had enough to eat. But this time, I wasn't that foolish. Before Jack could respond, Susan's eyes welled up with tears. "Mary, don't blame Jack. It's my fault. Please don't argue with him because of me. I won't come here anymore." Crying, she ran out the door. Jack looked at me with disappointment etched on his face. "Do you really have to be so harsh? How did you become like this?" In the past, this tactic of his always worked on me. Back then, I was completely infatuated with him. Jack was an educated youth, tall, refined, and nothing like the sweaty, rough village men. If he hadn't saved me from drowning, we wouldn't have ended up together. My insecurities made me overly concerned with his opinion, treating him like a deity that I dared not displease. But now, I simply gave him a cold, mocking smile. "Think whatever you want." Jack froze, stunned by the coldness in my eyes, and said nothing for a long while. I left him standing there and went into the bedroom alone. A few minutes later, Jack walked past the door with a bowl in his hands, chasing after Susan. Of course, the noodles he made specifically for her had to be personally delivered. That was the only way he'd be satisfied. A wave of pain crashed through my chest. I thought that having lived a whole lifetime already, those old wounds would have been buried by time. But it wasn't that easy. The bitterness and resentment were etched deeply in my heart, scars that continually reminded me of my foolishness. I turned my gaze away and picked up the calendar. On the date of the college entrance exams, I drew a heavy circle. In my previous life, I could have taken the exam too. Although I grew up in the village, I had studied up to high school. When the exams were reinstated, I was already married to Jack, with no money and the family needing someone to support it. My dreams of further education were buried. The one who made all the sacrifices, of course, was me. By the time I finally managed to support Jack enough for him to succeed, when I tried to pick up my books again, our neglected daughter was crying her heart out beside me. Jack stormed out of the study with an irritated expression. "Do you even know how to be a mother?" he snapped. "How can you be so heartless and ignore your own child?" When I suggested he help out a little, he shot back. "If I don't work, how are we supposed to feed the family?" Step by step, I compromised, until wrinkles began to creep into the corners of my eyes, and the years wore away my youth. On quiet, lonely nights, I would pick up the college entrance exam materials from that year and repeatedly go over them, as if doing so could fill the regret in my heart. Now, heaven has given me another chance. This time, I won't let anyone stand in my way. I opened the books and silently counted down in my mind. Just one more month. All I needed was one more month. When Jack returned home that night, it was already late. Seeing the cold stove and empty kitchen, he seemed stunned. In the past, no matter how late he came back, there was always a hot meal waiting for him. It had only been a single day, and he was already unsettled. When he noticed I had moved his belongings to the storage room, his steps faltered outside the door for a long while. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard his voice, soft and hesitant. What happened today was my fault. But, you know, Susan isn't an outsider. We both came here from the city as part of the same youth program. She's just a girl, unfamiliar with the area. As her big brother, I naturally have to take care of her. She's used to eating refined food in the city and can't stomach coarse grains. She's already lost weight. I couldn't just ignore her. Right. Big brother? What an excuse. In my past life, this big brother ended up sharing a bed with his little sister. The room fell silent again, save for the sound of our breathing. After what felt like an eternity, Jack spoke again, his voice low and muffled. If it makes you unhappy, I won't let her come here for meals anymore. I turned over and pretended not to hear him. I knew that no matter what he said, it wouldn't matter. As long as Susan shed a few tears in front of him and pleaded softly, Jack would forget all his so-called principles. I had long grown accustomed to it. In the days that followed, I kept up my normal routine, using every spare moment to study. Jack, who had planned to focus on his own preparations for the college entrance exams, found himself struggling. After I insisted we divide our food supplies, he had to start going out to the fields daily, hoe in hand, to maintain his rations and ensure there was enough refined flour to keep providing for Susan. Rumors began to spread in the village. People gossiped that I was deliberately hoarding white bread at home, trying to trap Jack so he couldn't take the exams and would have to stay stuck in the countryside with me. In the past, it wasn't uncommon for educated youth and local village girls to form families. But as soon as the men found a way back to the city, they'd abandon their wives and children without a second thought. Once back in the city, they had no trouble finding new wives. When someone asked Jack about it, he was evasive, refusing to give a clear answer, which only made the rumors more believable. By the time I heard about it, 5 days had passed. An older neighbor woman looked at me with approval. You've got your head screwed on straight. Girl, a man needs to be kept in check. What's the use of university or books? If he gets too successful, he'll just fly away. I knew she wasn't defending me. She was here for the drama. In their eyes, a village girl like me wasn't good enough for someone like Jack, a city boy. Naturally, they assumed I'd go to any lengths to tie him down. The thought made me sick to my stomach. Just as I was about to respond, a voice called out from behind me, "Sis." When I turned my head, I saw Jiang walking toward me, carrying a large sack of grain, his body drenched in sweat. After stepping inside, he patted the sack with a grin and let out a couple of sheepish laughs. If you want white flour, just tell me. From now on, you can eat as much as you want. It's an important time right now. Let your brother-in-law stay home and focus on studying. If he gets into college, he can take you to the city, and you'll finally live a good life. My mom passed away when I was 5 years old, and Jiang was only 2. Not long after, my dad remarried. While he tried his best to look after us, growing up under a stepmother's care was never easy, especially after my dad had more children with her. I didn't know how Jiang had managed to get his hands on the grain, but looking at his thin, bamboo-like frame, at an age when he should have been thriving, made my eyes well up. Jiang frowned and asked, "Sis, what's going on? Did Jack bully you? Tell me, and I'll take care of him." In my previous life, after I moved to the city, my life was in complete disarray. When Jiang visited, he had been living a tough life in the countryside, weathered and worn. But when he saw me eating a bowl of plain white rice with some pickled vegetables, his eyes turned red. He shoved the only 200-some yuan he had left into my hand. When I ran after him, he was already in his 30s, but he hunched over and ran away as fast as he could, as if afraid I might catch him. In that household, I was the kind of mother and wife who wasn't allowed a single word of complaint, merely a shadow in Jack's life, an uneducated village girl with no prospects. It had been a long time since I'd felt such unconditional care. I smiled and said, "I'm fine, Jiang. Everything is going well." But before I knew it, tears were streaming down my face. I made up some excuse to send him on his way, though I knew he didn't believe me. Still, I couldn't let him carry any more of my burdens. Later that evening, Jack came back from the fields. When he saw the pile of grain on the floor, his face lit up for a moment before turning awkward. "Your family came by?" I sneered. "Yeah. They heard the rumors about how I'm forcing my husband to work himself to death for white flour, and were worried I'd be drowned in everyone's spit." Jack's face flushed red. "Mary, I know I've let you down, but don't drag Susan into this. She's a city girl. She can't handle gossip like this. I'm just worried something might happen to her." He didn't finish, but I knew exactly what he meant. Back then, when our daughter suddenly came down with a high fever and needed to be hospitalized, I had already spent all the money we had to keep the household running. In the end, we had to borrow money from one of Jack's colleagues to pay for her treatment. His colleague had been puzzled. "Professor Jack, your salary isn't low. How do you not even have enough for an emergency like this?" Jack didn't dare admit that he'd given most of his money to Susan. Instead, he blamed me, saying, "I hand over my entire paycheck to my wife. Who knows how she squandered it all?" By the time I found out, I already had a reputation in Jack's circle as a wasteful, selfish woman. Everyone sympathized with him for having married someone like me. Even our neighbors took his side, complaining about how unfortunate he was. One of them once said, "Mary, I know you're not very educated. You indulge yourself every day, eating and drinking whatever you want, while poor Professor Jack is wearing a suit so worn it's fraying at the edges. If you keep this up, one day he'll realize he doesn't want you anymore, and then you'll regret it when it's too late." Furious, I confronted Jack about why he was treating me this way. Instead of apologizing, he responded self-righteously, "So what if people say a few things about you? You're just a housewife. You don't go out much anyway. Susan is different. She's out there running a business, and reputation is everything. We can't let gossip affect her." Time may have rewound, but Jack was still the same Jack. He hadn't changed. I didn't want to waste another word on him. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm, his expression tense. "Mary, can you promise not to talk to Susan about any of this? She's sensitive. You know. I swear. Once I pass the college entrance exam and we move back to the city, I won't deal with her anymore. It'll just be the two of us, living a good life together." It felt like a saw was cutting through my heart, tearing it apart piece by piece. The buried resentment I had thought was long gone resurfaced. I wanted to shout, just like I had in my previous life, and ask him why. Why did he treat me this way? Why was only Susan's dignity worth protecting, while mine meant nothing? But I lowered my eyes and forced down all my emotions. Some things, no matter how many times you say them, won't change. People who pretend to be asleep will never wake up. My lips curled into a cold smile, and I replied, "Don't worry. I won't trouble her." I turned and went back to my room, staring at the bold date circled on the calendar. I told myself, "Mary, you don't have much longer to endure. Just 20 more days, and you'll be free." Not only would I keep up this facade, but I'd ensure this charade continued uninterrupted. Jack believed he had plenty of time ahead of him, but he didn't know that this would be his only chance to take the college entrance exam. Once he returned to the city, his lazy, freeloading brothers would have already taken over the family's house and job prospects, and his harsh, selfish mother wouldn't support his education. Instead, she'd drain him dry to feed her other sons. With no money, no home, and no job, and with Susan constantly depending on him, where would Jack find the energy to take another exam? But none of that mattered to me anymore. The exam date drew closer each day, and I didn't want to waste another second on him, perhaps out of guilt. Jack didn't visit Susan in the days that followed. Even the food he used to bring her was now delivered by other educated youth. He started leaving early and coming home late. And one day, he even brought back a nest of bird eggs. I remembered when we were newlyweds. He had once brought me bird eggs from the forest, just like this. Back then, I boiled them and shared them with him. One for him and one for me. We had eaten them with sweet smiles, savoring every bite. But now, the sight of the eggs made me nauseous. Did he think I was so easily pacified? That a slap followed by a sweet treat could make everything better? The first person to break under the strain wasn't Jack. It was Susan. One day, while I was gathering firewood in the hills, she blocked my path. Susan was wearing a pale pink blouse, the slightly open collar revealing her fair, delicate neck. She stood there like a budding flower in the woods, completely out of place in the countryside and worlds apart from someone like me. A woman who had grown up rooted in the soil. She noticed my distracted gaze and a hint of pride flashed in her eyes. Looks good, right? Jack used ration coupons to get this fabric for me, Susan said smugly, as if expecting me to be furious. But I wasn't. Jack had given her far more than just money. He had provided her with startup capital for her business, connected her with influential people, and paved her way. In the past, I had tossed and turned through sleepless nights, consumed by anger and countless arguments with him. But over time, I grew tired of fighting, and eventually, I stopped caring. As I turned to leave, Susan blocked my way again. Mary, she sneered. Do you think Jack would have ever looked at you if you hadn't deliberately fallen into the river and tricked him into saving you? Jack doesn't belong to you, and he certainly doesn't belong in this backwater village. He has so many dreams and ambitions. Once he gets into college and sees the broader world outside, do you really think you'll still be worthy of him? These were the same words Susan had thrown at me in my past life. Back then, she was sitting in a luxury car, looking at me with disdain as I walked home from the market with groceries. Jack only married you to have someone bear his children and take care of his family. You're no different from a nanny. But his love and money, those are all mine. At the time, her words had stabbed into my heart like a knife. But now, they only made me laugh coldly. Have you said enough? I asked, my tone icy. If you liked him so much, why didn't you get together with him before we got married? Back then, Susan had been cozying up to the village chief's son, hoping to use their connections to find a way back to the city. When the college entrance exams were reinstated, she realized she hadn't put any effort into studying and couldn't pass on her own. That's when she turned her attention back to Jack. Susan's face twisted in an odd expression before she suddenly dropped to her knees with a loud thud. Tears streamed from her eyes. Sis-in-law, I promise I'll stay away from Jack from now on. Please. I'm begging you. Don't report this to the commune. It would ruin him. Before I could make sense of her strange behavior, she suddenly shoved me hard. I lost my footing and tumbled down the slope, scattering the firewood I had been carrying. My ankle was scraped by a piece of wood, and blood began to drip steadily from the wound. But before I could react, a figure rushed past me, running straight towards Susan. When I finally steadied myself and looked up, I saw Jack holding Susan, who was covered in dirt but otherwise unharmed, in his arms. His gaze was icy as he turned to me. I've told you before. If you're angry, take it out on me. Why do you have to make trouble for someone who has nothing to do with this? Someone who has nothing to do with this? I asked coldly, pulling up my torn pant leg to reveal my bleeding wound. Are your eyes blind? Do people who harm others usually end up injuring themselves like this? Jack's gaze flicked to the blood pooling around my ankle, and his expression faltered briefly. But then Susan, with tears streaming down her face, tugged on his sleeve pitifully. Jack, she sobbed. It's my fault. Let's just say I caused this. I was scared she'd report us to the commune. If you get a blemish on your record, you won't be able to take the college entrance exam. She cried harder and paled, collapsing dramatically into Jack's arms. And he believed her. Or maybe he just wanted an excuse to justify his already biased feelings. He cast me a cold glance before turning and carrying Susan away. Watching their retreating figures, I unclenched my fists, letting the numb coldness in my heart dissipate little by little. It didn't matter. There were only 10 days left. I could endure this. To comfort the overly distraught Susan, Jack didn't return home until very late that night. From then on, he seemed to have found a reason to justify meeting with Susan repeatedly. Even at night, I didn't know what they were doing outside, nor did I care. Lying in bed, I kept replaying the lessons I had reviewed during the day. This younger body was truly remarkable. In my previous life, as I aged, I couldn't retain anything no matter how many times I read it. But now, the material seemed to blend effortlessly into my mind, giving me a sense of peace. However, even as I drifted into sleep, an inexplicable unease lingered in my heart, as though I had forgotten something important. That unease became clear when I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud crash. I suddenly remembered. In my previous life, around this time, there had been a heavy rainstorm. The house Jack and I lived in had been provided by the village for the educated youth. It was old and poorly maintained. During that storm, the house couldn't withstand the downpour and collapsed. Back then, Jack and I weren't home when it happened. But this time, I wasn't so lucky. Large raindrops pelted my face and body as a deafening thunderclap split the sky. Lightning illuminated the collapsed roof tiles and the fallen beams around me. Looking at the precarious state of the house, I shivered. Braving the rain, I groped my way through the darkness. Heaven had given me a second chance, and I hadn't yet taken the college entrance exams or built a better life for Jiyoung and me. I couldn't die here. But just as I thought this, the weakened wall beside me gave way under the relentless rain, collapsing and pinning my lower body beneath the heavy debris. The weight of the soil felt like an anchor dragging me down. I struggled and screamed for help, but the torrential rain drowned out my voice. I was suddenly overwhelmed with bitterness. Why had heaven given me this second chance only to put me through this torment? I hated Jack. If he hadn't gone to see Susan, I wouldn't be in this situation. But more than anything, I hated myself for being so consumed with preparing for the exams that I had forgotten something so critical. The rain continued to pour, draining all the warmth from my body. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, I heard someone calling my name loudly. With great effort, I opened my eyes and saw Jiyoung in the rain, frantically digging at the soil with his bare hands, crying and laughing at the same time. "Sis, don't fall asleep. I'll get you out soon," he shouted. "Someone help. My sister is trapped here. Come and help." His cries brought my father and more villagers to the scene. Together, they worked to free me. When I was finally lifted onto an open patch of ground, someone suddenly remembered. "Wait. Wasn't Jack inside too? Is he still trapped under the rubble? Quick, look for him." But they didn't need to search for long. Jack stood in the crowd, holding an umbrella over Susan. The sudden commotion had drawn most of the village to the scene. Some held torches, others carried kerosene lamps, lighting up the open area. Amidst the brightly lit gathering, Jack stood there, seemingly unaffected. When his gaze landed on me, his expression changed, and the umbrella slipped from his hand as he rushed toward me. But Jiyoung was faster. He delivered a swift kick that sent Jack sprawling into the mud and water. Without hesitation, Jiyoung pinned him down and punched him repeatedly. "You bastard," he roared. "When my sister was in danger, where were you? Tell me, where exactly were you? Do you even realize she almost died just now?" Jiyoung roared at Jack, his voice trembling with anger. Susan let out a sharp scream, trying to pull Jiyoung away, but he swung his hand back and slapped her hard across the face. "You shameless woman. I've had enough of you. You sit here every day eating the white bread my brother-in-law sends you, and yet you still cling to my sister? How low do you have to stoop to feel satisfied? Stealing someone else's man." Jack's appearance in the middle of the night with Susan, leaving me behind, had already struck the villagers as suspicious. Jiyoung's outburst only added fuel to the fire. "I told you there was something fishy about those two," one person said. "I've seen Jack sneaking food to Susan more than once. When I confronted him, he even had the nerve to say Mary told him to do it." Another added, "Tisk. Men from the city are unreliable. They've got wives but can't keep their eyes to themselves." Someone else muttered, "And that Susan is no better. She knows he's married but still cozies up to him. This is what city manners are like." The villagers' voices grew louder, each accusation sharper than the last. Susan, red-faced and teary-eyed, looked desperately at Jack, who was still lying on the ground, stunned. Jack finally began to move, struggling to his feet. "Jiyoung, let me go. I need to check on your sister." But Susan, overwhelmed by the villagers' scorn, burst into sobs, clutching her face, and ran off into the darkness. The rain poured harder. My father glanced at my pale face and called out to Jiyoung, stopping him before he could strike Jack again. Jiyoung delivered one last punch, knocking Jack back into the mud. "Don't think my sister is easy to bully. I'm letting you off easy this time. But if you dare pull this again, I'll kill you." As we began to leave, the crowd gradually dispersed, leaving Jack lying motionless in the rain-soaked dirt. In the pitch-black night, the distance between Jack and me grew with each step, just like in my previous life. After I got married, My place in my family's home was gone. The village chief could only arrange for me to stay in a small storage room they had hastily cleaned out. My father, seeing that I was settled, left under my stepmother's impatient urging. Everything that had happened today felt like a whirlwind. I stared blankly at the barren walls of the room until I suddenly remembered the textbooks I had left behind in the muddy water. Startled, I jumped to my feet, but Jiang stopped me, holding out a bundle. "Sis, is this what you're looking for?" I took it from him and, upon seeing the intact books inside, couldn't stop the tears of relief from streaming down my face. "Thank goodness," I murmured. Jiang looked at me and asked hesitantly, "Sis, are you planning to take the college entrance exam?" I didn't know when he had figured it out or how much he knew about Jack and Susan. As his sister, I felt like I had failed him in so many ways. Bitterly, I nodded. Jiang then asked, "And him? What about Jack?" "Jiang, I'm going to divorce him," I said firmly. His eyes widened in shock, and for a long time, he didn't say anything. I knew he was willing to stand up for me, to beat Jack to a pulp, even force him to apologize. But divorce? He had never considered that. In this era, divorce carried a heavy stigma. Even if Jack was at fault, I would be the one branded with shame, simply because I was a woman. He was about to say something when a sudden knock on the door interrupted us. Jack's muffled voice came from outside. "Mary, are you there?" "It's me." I noticed a flash of anger in Jiang's eyes, but I stopped him. "I'll handle this," I said. Some things needed to be addressed, and I'd held back my words for far too long. Standing at the doorway, Jack was soaked from head to toe, his face bruised and swollen from Jiang's punches. Despite his disheveled appearance, he looked at me with concern. "Mary, are you hurt? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine worry. But his concern only felt like a cruel joke to me. I couldn't see what purpose his words served now. "I'm fine," I said coldly. "Jack, let's get a divorce." A flash of lightning lit up the sky, freezing the shocked expression on his face. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. "Mary, I know you're angry. What happened today was my fault. I shouldn't have been away when you were in danger. I'll change. Promise. I won't ever let something like this happen again." I had no patience left to argue with him. I cut straight to the point. "And what about Susan? Are you just going to leave your dear little sister behind?" My voice was sharp. "How long are you going to keep pretending your divided affections are nothing more than a brother's concern for his sister? How much longer will you deceive yourself?" My words seemed to strike a nerve. His lips quivered, and he stammered, "It's not like that. I only looked after Susan because she needed help. I've already sent a letter to my family. I told them I'd bring you back to the city with me. I've made up my mind. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." "Is that so?" I replied, my tone icy. "Well, I don't care anymore." Jack's expression faltered, and a sense of defeat flickered in his eyes. He forced a weak smile. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'll wait for you to change your mind. We have so much time ahead of us. I'll make you forgive me." I didn't respond. Instead, I quietly closed the door in his hopeful face. Only 3 days left. Soon, I would embark on a new life. A life without Jack. There was nothing more to say between us. On the day of the college entrance exam, Jiang woke up early to see me off. At the exam site, I saw Jack standing near the entrance, and beside him was Susan. She seemed to be talking to him, but he looked distracted. When he saw us, his eyes lit up. Jack quickly approached me, his tone soft and ingratiating. "Mary, are you here to wish me luck? Don't worry, I'll do my best on the exam. Once we're back in the city, I'll make sure you have a good life." Before I could reply, Jiang cut in coldly. "You're delusional." I explained that I was there to take the exam. Beside Jack, Susan let out a loud, disdainful laugh, her face full of scorn. To her, the college entrance exam was a privilege for people like them, and someone like me, a simple village girl, had no right to be part of it. Jack seemed equally surprised. It was almost funny. Even Jiang had known I was preparing for the exam. But Jack, who lived with me day in and day out, hadn't noticed a thing. He opened his mouth to say something, but the bell signaling the start of the exam cut him off. I walked past him with the crowd, leaving him far behind. This exam was something I had dreamed about for a lifetime. At this moment, I wanted to pour every ounce of focus into it. Jack and Susan no longer mattered. They were completely forgotten as I stepped into the exam hall. The 3-day exam flew by. After it ended, I didn't return to the village. Instead, I went to the neighboring town, where my cousin ran a small clothing shop. She had heard I wanted to save money and offered me a job. Each day, I woke up at dawn to clean the shop, organize the merchandise, and greet customers with a smile as they came in and left. My time here was so fulfilling that I hardly noticed how quickly the days passed. One day, Jiang burst into the shop, panting heavily. His excitement was palpable as he grabbed my hands. "Sis, you did it. You got into college." My heart leaped into my throat. With trembling hands, I took the acceptance letter, the very thing I had dreamed of in my past life. Tears streamed down my face before I even realized I was crying. Finally, I had escaped the fate of my previous life. From this moment on, I would walk a new path. As he wiped away my tears, Jiang couldn't hide his smugness. "Sis, you don't know yet, do you? You're the only one from the village who got into college. Apart from one other educated youth, Jack and Susan didn't pass." It's hilarious. They were acting so self-assured before. And now they're just a joke. I wasn't surprised. Jack was intelligent, but he had spent all his time recently wrapped up in his drama with Susan, leaving no room to focus on studying. As for Susan, she hadn't passed in our previous life either. Calmly, I asked, "Did you take care of what I asked you to do?" Jiang had originally been against my decision to divorce Jack, but over time, I had proven to him that I could live just fine without Jack. And now I had even been accepted into college. He raised an eyebrow. "It's done. I read the divorce agreement you wrote aloud to Jack in front of the village chief. Sis, you should have seen his face. It was like he'd been struck by lightning. He went pale as a sheet and said he wouldn't agree to it. He claimed he'd wait for you forever." Jiang sneered. "If he's so broken-hearted now, why didn't he act better before? It's pathetic." I chuckled indifferently. Whatever Jack said or did now couldn't affect me in the slightest. To me, he was just a stranger, a passerby with no connection to my life. From this point forward, our lives would never intersect again. The last time I saw Jack was 6 years later. By then, I had graduated, been assigned a stable job, and had a new fiancé. That day, Jiang came to the provincial capital and invited us out for a meal. Since I had gone to college, I had brought him along with me to the city. In this era, opportunities for business were everywhere. Initially, I taught Jiang how to set up a small stall outside the school gates. As the business grew, he started learning from others and began sourcing goods wholesale from Guangzhou to sell. Over time, his business flourished, and he eventually bought a house and a car. When I saw him again after many years, he was dressed sharply in a suit, carrying himself with confidence and charisma. He looked even more polished and successful than most city folks. That evening, we had just finished a meal at a restaurant and were stepping outside when, not far away, I noticed a street vendor stooped over, using his hands to create sugar paintings for children. His hunched back and limp were unmistakable. When he saw me, a flicker of panic crossed his face. Without a second thought, he abandoned the money on the table, hurriedly pushed his cart, and limped away as fast as he could. It was Jack. 6 years after our last meeting. Over the years, I had heard bits and pieces about him, mostly because Jiang, still harboring a grudge, would occasionally dig around for news about him. I knew that after returning to the city, Jack had married Susan. He had planned to take the college entrance exam again, but his family had no money, and there was no one foolish enough to support him like I once had. After struggling for a long time, he finally resigned himself to his fate. Unable to find a proper job, he started a street vending business. But Susan, used to a life of comfort, couldn't handle the hard work. She had wanted a good life with Jack, not one where she had to wake up early and stay out late running a stall. One day, she used Jack's name to scam someone out of a large sum of money, then abandoned him and their newborn daughter, fleeing on her own. When the creditors couldn't find her, They broke one of Jack's legs and stationed themselves outside his home, demanding repayment. From that point on, Jack's life became what it was now. Jiang glanced at Jack's pitiful state and let out a sarcastic chuckle. My fiancé, noticing the scene, asked curiously, "Who is that? Why did he run away when he saw us?" I withdrew my gaze and replied calmly, "Just someone unimportant. Don't worry about him. Let's go."